Hello. Today we're just going to be continuing off with what we ended from our last PowerPoint, which is mainly dealing with the MPJE Review 2 about controlled substances. So this is just a continuation of that in MPJE Review 3. And then on MPJE Review 4, which we're going to be doing also in this video, we're dealing with compounding. And I'm just going to talk about compounding in this lecture as well. So, there's some erratas that I've noticed when I was watching the video. So, with C2 prescriptions, um, we can do a legal fax prescription on some of narcotics, such as those that we can compound parenterally, sub-Q, IM, IV, or intraspinal. Another one that we can do legal fax prescription of is those that are in long-term care and then those that are hospice patients. So this is differ from the 60-day partial fill that I talked about. So this one you can fax it. The 60-day partial fill of long-term care and hospice patients in C2, those are different thing and not the exact same thing as I discussed on the video. Okay, so we didn't talk about the Form 222, so I'm just gonna talk about what's in the Form 222. So Form 222, as we talked about briefly, is dealing with purchase of a C2 drug. Form 222 also can be used for distribution and for transfer purposes. So for instance, if you're going to be transferring from one Walgreens to another, right? And you would need Form 222 for that in addition to the distribution of that C2 drug. So usually with Form 222, it's obtained when registering with DEA. Some things to really know when it comes to Form 222, the supplier can substitute the package size. So for instance, you've ordered an oxycodone, um, and what happens is that you've ordered for 200 count of those oxycodones, but the NDC that you put in on that Form 222 is under a certain one. But when you've noticed, right, so with NDCs, remember the last two deals more so on those package size. So if the package size is different, but your quantity is the same, that's going to be fine. So that's just something to know for Form 222. Other thing to know for Form 222 is that supplier needs to record the number of items in each container and the date of shipment on the original form. This is important because it's just going to ensure that those meds are keeping track, making sure that the stuff that is ordered is the stuff that is ordered. Now, once the medications are delivered into the purchaser's address, what's going to happen then is that the purchaser, the one that purchased the drug, needs to record the item received and the date received on the copy of the Form 222. So, important thing to know when you're filling Form 222, you can't do it with a pencil, you can't erase it. It needs to be done on indelible ink. Um, could be done, I believe, on a typewriter, those kinds of things. But one thing that anyone that fills a Form 222, you can't um, you can't have like a dirty or just error-filled Form 222. This makes it void and should be kept in a record-keeping purposes. But with an error, you need to execute another Form 222. So remember, when you're executing another Form 222, you're going to have a different serial number. So that's just something to know. Um, Here it talks about power of attorney that gives a person the ability to fill out Form 222 and can be more than one person and doesn't have to be in a registered location where they keep the executed Form 222s. and stuff like that. Okay. So here on the right hand side of the screen, it talks about what happens if you lost or if the 222 got lost or got stolen in the mail. So first of all, when that happens, the purchaser needs to execute another 222 and supply a statement that has the serial number of the lost form, date, and the C2s that were not received. So if the supplier, the one that has the drug, received the lost or stolen 222, they should void it because you have a statement that has those things, so they know that they should void it. Okay, and that what happens also, so this is another case, if somehow there is a loss or stolen from the purchaser, so meaning you this doesn't happen in the mail. This happen if, I don't know, some people in the pharmacy have lost the form, then you should notify the DEA so you can have form 222s. When it comes to record keeping, it must be kept in a registered location, as I discussed earlier. Okay. Um, Before I talk about controlled substances ordering system, I think I didn't really put it on the slides. Um, so we know DEA Form 41 is for waste, but when it comes to waste, there's two different ways to do it. So the first one is through filling the DEA Form 41, right, in which you need to have two witnesses that shows that this is being destroyed and whatnot, and that you're notified your DEA about it. The second one is really going back into the manufacturer in which you in which you fill Form 222, right? Because you're um, doing a reverse distributor in which you're going to then send it back to the manufacturer and also have to use DA Form 41 to waste it. Okay, so bottom line, with those instances, um, it deals with DA Form 41, which is that waste component. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the controlled substances ordering system. So um, this is another way to order controlled substances, but this one covers not only C2, it covers C3, C4, and C5. So with Form 222, in which I forgot to talk about, if there's any partial orders that needs to get fulfilled, the supplier has to do it within 60 days upon the issuance of the Form 222, and here as well upon issuance of the order. This is sort of similar with the Form 222. With Form 222, you need to have authorization for those registered location. This is sort of the similar thing. You need to have a digital certificate instead of that authorization for each of those DEA registered location. And the one that does it is the registrant or the power of attorney. So just like with Form 222, any defective orders are voided. Um, Purchaser must create a record of quantity of each item, receipt and date for receipt. And just like with Form 222, the supplier can cancel or void all orders. One thing to note for is that unfulfilled electronic order is lost, is that the purchaser needs to have a statement including the tracking number, date of lost order, and goods that were not received. Okay, this is just a little blurb of what invoices is, but essentially these are for C3, C4, and C5. This one contains the order of those medications, and also in some cases you're going to have non-controlled substances. So typically, if you've ever worked in a hospital, you're going to have this report. Usually, you're going to have like an order of lisinopril here in combination with the benzos right there and things like that. So one way to differentiate between lisinopril right here and then the benzos right here is to try to put a star of those non-controlled to make sure that those are differentiated from those controlled substances. So once you've seen the orders for those benzos or any controlled substances from C3 to C4 and C5, um, what you're going to do, kind of like with Form 222, you're supposed to be checking whether you've received that medication, whether you've received the proper total amount of prescription that you're on, and from there you're supposed to sign it and date it, just like this. So it doesn't matter where you sign and date it, but it needs to be signed and dated. Okay, so this one we're going to be talking about methadone and Suboxone. So these ones are based on DA Form 363. So let's begin with methadone. So methadone is a little special because it's used for pain and for um, detoxification purposes, right? So when it comes to pain, any pharmacy can dispense it when used for pain. So this is like important delineation from what I'm going to be talking about next. So it's used for the treatment of pain. But when it comes to narcotic treatment facilities, they need to have what is known as the DA Form 363 to make sure that they can dispense the methadone for patients that are needing for opioid addiction or for detoxification purposes, and that it needs to be prescribed with a DA registered prescriber. And then here on the right hand side, we have buprenorphine. So before, this is just a little history blurb. There's a data waiver program, and basically what it is that the prescribers need to get an XDA number. They need to have only certain amount of patients for opioid use disorder, but now they just have to meet what is known as like a training in lieu of this. So once they meet the training and other requirements, they just like with methadone, they can prescribe buprenorphine for the purposes of opioid use disorder, but they need to have a Schedule 3 authority if permitted by that state law. So it's important to go back into the state-specific prescribers. So different states, of course, have different prescribing authority to certain healthcare providers. So that's something to note for. Okay. So with methadone, this is an important blurb that I really want to hammer down. So with methadone, the prescriber can only dispense. They cannot prescribe from their inventory unless if they're in an opioid treatment facility, a 3-day supply for one person use at a time for detoxification or maintenance treatment. So that is an important thing that we're gonna delineate it from the ones that are in opioid use treatment facility. And with the buprenorphine, um, you can't have an office stock. So what I mean by office stock here is that they're gonna order buprenorphine, stock them, and then basically just give buprenorphine for these patients without a prescription. So with this, they need to have a prescription, all right, for patients who have opioid use disorder, and that they need to be administered within 14 days of delivery. Okay. We're gonna talk about what is included in a prescription. So in a prescription, these are like some of the things that are included. So the numero uno in there, and typically what is on the upper right hand corner is date of issuance. So important to note for here is that pre or post dating is not allowed. So meaning um you can't like issue it for future date except for certain circumstance, which we're going to talk about. But date of issuance, that's important. Name and address of the patient. You need to have the name, strength, dose form, quantity prescribed, and directions for use. You need to have number of refills authorized or the stop date. So in a hospital, there will be like stop date for antibiotics and things like that. You need to have it in a prescription or what we call orders in a hospital. And then you have route of administration, name, address, telephone number, prescriber, the signature prescriber, and the DA number if it's applicable. So here, DA number, of course, is going to be applicable in controlled substances. Another thing that is not on this slide and not on this lessons is what's included on the label. So typically, um, what's included in the label, of course, are the name of the patient. It needs to have the pharmacy name, pharmacy address, but you don't need the telephone number or how many refills are there in a prescription. It's the established name is needs to be there. Of course, it needs to be there. The directions for use, the physician that ordered it, things like that. Okay. This one talks about transferring a prescription. So when you're transferring a prescription, it could be used by computer or data system for pharmacies accessing the same prescription record. What they mean here is that if you're using Walgreens to Walgreens, then you can use the same data system for it or software, basically. And once transferred, the prescription cannot be refilled more than what's originally listed on the prescription. That's very important, or 1 year, or whichever is less. The original and transferred prescription must be kept for 3 years following the last dispensing, and then the pharmacist interns or certified technicians may make or receive transfers for all non-controlled prescriptions, but there's no limit on number of times a non-controlled substance can be transferred. So that's important thing. When refilling a prescription, the prescribers can write a PRN refills for a prescription, but this is no more than 1 year after the date that was issued, unless if it's stated otherwise. So, for example, if they put lisinopril PRN times 2 years here, instead of it only lasting for a year after the date that it was issued, now it's going to last for 2 years. Here on the second bullet point, it talks about if deemed appropriate, a patient may receive drug quantities in excess of the face amount of prescription for a non-controlled substances up to the total amount authorized. So, for example, you have a prescription for lisinopril. So, so you have an example here for lisinopril 10, and it's good for, let's just say, 270 tablets total, but you're going out of town and you would need 60 of them. Okay. Typically, with this, you're given a 30-day supply in which you're supposed to be taking this once in a day. Since you have a total of 270 tablets here, you can actually get 60 or 90 tablets because it's a non-controlled substances. And lastly, we have the Ryan Height Online Pharmacy Consumer Protection Act. The goal on this Ryan Height Online Pharmacy Consumer Protection Act is are as follows. Basically, before there's a gray area when it comes to online pharmacy. So people can buy like untrustable and unreputable um, controlled substances and things like that. So that makes it easier for people to buy controlled substances that is not legit and could potentially be fatal for these people that are buying it. The thing about Ryan Haidt Online Pharmacy and Consumer Protection Act, they have like certain requirements, really depending on what state you're in which they're going to set a certain requirements, usually set by NABP. And here, basically, um, the bottom line is that no controlled substances may be delivered, dispensed, or distributed by means of internet pharmacy without a valid prescription. The thing about this also is that you can't just prescribe or sorry, you can't just deliver, dispense, or distribute a controlled substances without having that oh, one in-person medical visit. So that's very important, and that you can't also just um, dispense or distribute controlled substances without a legitimate medical purpose in that prescriber's usual course of professional practice. This one is just a little blurb about pseudoephedrine, but with this, the pharmacy must post a sign and they need to say that prohibits the purchase of more than 3.6 grams total per day and 9 grams per 30-day period. So they need to have that exact verbiage. Thing about pseudoephedrine, it's 18 and older, depending on what state you're in. Definitely, these are one of those products that are stored, but in North Carolina, it's sold behind a pharmacy counter. And pseudoephedrine products in North Carolina can be sold only in blister packages. You need to have ID upon the sale of information, and that needs to be submitted to NPLEX. Here, the NPLEX will flag you if the patient goes above that 3.6 grams a day or that 9 grams per month. The other thing that wasn't listed here is the 7.5 grams if the patient decides to do a meal for 30 days. Okay, so that's more on the 30 days. And the records for pseudoephedrine needs to be kept for 2 years and must be available within 48 hours. The other thing about pseudoephedrine, we talked about the DEA form that is required for pseudoephedrine. So with pseudoephedrine, of course, we're dealing the with DEA form 510. So it's just important to know about that. Okay. And this is just good illustration of what's in of what I just talked about. So 3.6 grams a day, 9 grams per 30 days, 7.5 grams if it's mail order. Restrictions apply only to the retail sales. Okay, so if it's only over the counter, that's the only time you're dealing with pseudoephedrine. If it's prescription, it doesn't matter. And you're dealing with Form 510, as I just talked about. Okay, now we're going to talk about the bulk of this lesson, which deals with compounding. Okay, so these are just some of the groundwork. Um, if y'all haven't studied for NAPLEX, this won't kind of make sense, but I try to make it a little bit better to understand. So essentially, with groundwork, I'm just going to verbatimly read this. Non-sterile, sterile, and hazardous must have a designated person that is qualified and trained to be responsible for implementing a certain type of procedure. Here, they can also designate more than one person, but it doesn't need to be a pharmacist. So a tech can be a designated person here. When we're dealing with compounding, compounding isn't just mixing or reconstituting, so meaning you're just putting distilled water or other acts performed in accordance contain in approved labeling or supplemental materials provided by manufacturers. So if you're following what's just literally stated by the manufacturer, you're not doing compounding. You're just following what's in that thing. But when you're adding flavoring, this is considered compounding. The reason behind this is because you're ruining the stability of that particular product. So here you're actually making different stuff. Other general rule, preparations needs to be designed to be delivered to a body that doesn't have a contact with environment outside of the body, that needs to be sterile prepared. Eye products and compounded aqueous inhalation suspensions and solutions are sterile, but anything that is prepared in the ear, like your otic preparations, doesn't really need to be required to be sterile, unless if the patient had a perforated eardrum, in which it needs to be sterile. Irrigations for the mouth, rectal cavity, and sinus cavity, and nasal sprays don't have to be sterile. Other thing as well is that pharmacies should not make compounding products that are commercially available. They're essentially not following um, the Food Drug Act rights. So that's a no-no. Um, but compounding, just like what I said, if you're changing something that could potentially affect the stability of the product, so you change the form, strength, or probably take out some things, such as if you take out an inactive ingredient because a patient might have allergy to it, that's definition of compounding. Another thing is that pharmacy should use a component of USB, or what we call national formulary monograph, if it exists. If not, they can use a FDA drug bulk list for use in compounding. It's important to note that the compounded products are not adherent of the CGMP and FDA. So you're not dealing with FDA labeling for compounding, which is an important delineation when it comes to the outsourcing facilities. Antibiotics, cytotoxic, hazardous materials call for the pharmacy to have specific equipment. We're going to talk about more about 797 and 800 in this presentation. Okay, so we have non-sterile compounding. So when it comes to non-sterile, so personal training. So we already talked about that there needs to be a designated person that basically is the one involved with the training and qualifications, and also the ones that are doing these things needs to be trained and qualified by showing their knowledge and competency based on the 795 standards. So anything with non-sterile is 795 and should be trained initially. So you're going to start off initially and every 12 months thereafter. Knowledge should include the requirements of 795, understanding and interpreting the SDS, which are the safety data sheets, and understanding procedures relating to compounding duties. All of this needs to get documented in the pharmacy must reevaluate annually. Here, the gloves are required and be worn when compounding. Change or wipes gloves before new compounding procedures. Gowns can be reused only if it's not torn, punctured, or soiled. You can reuse gowns only, not gloves or another garb, as long as the gown is not soiled or torn, not turned. Cleaning should happen before starting compounding each time. The temp in the storage areas, such as the fridge, needs to get monitored daily. Knowledge and competency should be demonstrated initially and then every 12 months for those that clean and sanitize. Containers used must not alter the quality, strength, or purity of compounded drug preparation and must be stored off floor and prevent contamination. And when you're stocking non sterile compounded products, stock older drug first. Okay, these are just little differentiation between MFR or master formulation record versus compounding record. Master formulation record, basically what it is that this is what is known as the recipe. So a recipe, kind of like when you have a cookbook, it will contain um, specific amounts of the drug product and whatnot. So it's included on those compounding, or sorry, on that master formulation record. And it needs to be created before new preparation is compounded in a pharmacy for the very first time. This is opposed to the compounding records. So the compounding record needs to be completed each time a prep occurs. So this one is more so where you're going to be listing what you prepared. Um, you're going to put here the ones that you use. Um, you're also going to be putting here the beyond use dates. You're going to be putting here how much of the stuff that you made, the pharmacist that has verified what you've created, the person that created the particular compounded product, things like that. So this is a good example of what a master formulation record is compared to a compounding record. So let's say you made a metformin solution, 20 grams versus 60 grams. Because it's the same drug, the master formulation records should be the same. But the compounding record is different because you're producing different strength of the product that you have. These are non-sterile compounding for what needs to be included in a master formulating records compared to the compounding records. So yeah. And then other important thing, and I think might show up on the exam, are the beyond use dates for non-sterile products. So beyond use dates of the non-sterile products are based on what is known as a water activity. So what it is that if your water activity is high, this is usually something like solutions or any kind of like liquid, um, non-sterile products. You look at its water activity. If it's greater than or equal to 0.60, and if it's non-preservative, you're dealing with 14 days and it needs to be kept in a fridge. However, if there's a preservative, the AW is greater than 0.60 and 35 days and can be kept room temp or fridge. For creams and ointments and things of that sort, their AW would be less than 0.60, so the beyond use date is a little bit longer than those that are liquid. So if it's the oral liquid is less than 0.60, it's 90 days. Similar to the one with preservatives, can be kept at room temp or fridge. And if it's non-oral liquids with an AW of less than 0.60, it's 180 days and it's kept in room temp or fridge. This is a busy slide, but it talks about sterile compounding. So sterile compounding um, is basically dealing with injectables now. And what we're talking about, such as those that are those ophthalmic products and things of that sort. So USB classifies sterile compounding into three categories. So you have the first category that is not as strict compared to the third category. So with first category, it just needs to be in a controlled environment conditions, such as being placed in a hood in what is known as a segregated compounded area. And typically your beyond use date here is less than or equal to 12 hours at a controlled room temperature or less than or equal to 24 hours refrigerated. With category two, you have more stringent things going on. So here it required more environmental controls and more testing than category one. So now your beyond use date is greater than 12 hours at controlled room temperature and 24 hours refrigerated but not exceeded the limits. And then you have category three that has more and has one of the strictest controls, which they need to have sterility testing, endotoxin testing, um, more personal qualification, use of sterile garb, use of sporcidal disinfectants, have more frequent environmental monitoring, things like that, in which they can actually have a longer beyond use state. Here in the section 3.1, it talks about some of the things that are needed before they enter the compounded area, such as removing all of the cosmetics, getting rid of their personal outer garments, remove all hand wrists and other exposed jewelry, including piercings that could interfere with the effectiveness of garbing, getting rid of the earbuds or headphones, not, bringing the electronic device in the compounding area, keeping the nails clean and well trimmed, and having their eyeglass wiped if it's worn. We're also going to talk about some of the garbing requirements later, but the minimum garbing requirements in a category one and two is low lint covers for shoes, low lint cover for head that covers the hair and ears, low lint face mask, sterile powder free gloves if it's you're doing hazardous ish type of thing, low lint garment, and if you're using what is known as the RABs, whether it's a compounding isolator or the khaki, disposable gloves should be worn inside the gloves attached to the wrap sleeve. So that's just important thing to add on besides what we just talked about. Okay, so when it comes to cleaning, there's three different categories. So the first one is the actual cleaning component where you remove organic and inorganic contaminants. The second one is disinfectant, which only destroys the microbes. And then the last one is the sporicidal, which destroys the vegetative species. So this is more thorough cleaning, I guess, one way to think about it. This is important about like when you're supposed to be cleaning the hood or the pack, the pass-through chambers, the work surfaces outside the pack, floors, things like that. So it's important that cleaning must be done daily. Sporicidal agents should be applied monthly. Walls, doors, ceiling, shelves, things that are not really used as much can be done monthly, and then the sporicidal agent should be done monthly. When you're doing garbing, the principle here is you start from the dirty stuff to clean stuff. Should be performed in the anteroom. The reason why is because there's a balance between clean and dirty air. So remember, in the hood, you have the cleanest air, but the more that you go out of the hood and into the pharmacy or into the anteroom, you still have some ISO 7 or 8 going on, depending on what it is. So you're still getting some clean air, but it's not as clean compared to ISO 5. which is good, right? Because in this case, because you're um, still have a little bit of better sterility going on in this scenario. When the minimum attire here is head cover, facial cover, face mask, shoe cover, gown, gloves, and as I talked about earlier, needs to be low lift. Um, so these are some of the steps to do the garbing. So we already talked about you need to remove those things. But the second step is you apply the head covers, facial head covers, face mask. So it's important to do head first, then the shoe. Then apply the shoe cover. Then you're going to wash with soap and warm water for greater than or equal to 30 seconds. Wash up the elbows, clean under the nails using a scraper. Dry it with low-lint towel, put on the gown, then put on the sterile gloves, and must be done in anteroom, buffer room, or segregated compounded area. And you need to put in an alcohol-based hand rub. It's usually a 70% isopropyl alcohol, and apply sterile gloves. Dispose all garb except gown if it's kept in clean area, and rewear during worksheet. These ones are just some of the factoids when it comes to sterile compounding. So, um, yeah, when you're doing a sterile compounding for hazardous sterile products or for hazardous products, you need to include any items on the current NIOSH list that the entity handles, and it must be reviewed at least every 12 months and whenever a new agent or dosage form is used. Um, we know that standard operating procedures are written by pharmacy and facility and are required to be maintained and made, must address training requirements for compounders, selection of components, beyond use dates, labeling, and initial and ongoing training is required for those people that enter the clean room only for cleaning slash restocking. Any person that enters a sterile compounding area, whether making a um, compounded product or not, must meet garbing requirements. And personnel who do not compound nor have direct oversight or of compounders but do other tasks like cleaning or disinfecting may need to be trained per facilities standard operating procedures. It's important to know that personnel that make sterile products are required to undergo training initially and media fill testing of aseptic skills. So, media fill is basically you're making the product. So this is after, sorry, this is usually before glove testing, which is a different thing. With glove testing, which I didn't talk about it here, you're basically going to be making some stuff, and then what happens next is that you're basically gonna roll your gloves that you had and then let it incubate for a certain amount of time. And if it grows something, then that's bad. With media field testing, you're making something. Usually you're pulling, I don't know, I heard from different people 10, 20 different times, putting it in the same bag. If there's something growing, then yeah, there's microbial growth growing. But in here, every 6 months for the compounders of category 1 and 2 preparations, where they have to do those media fill testing. Every 3 months for category 3 prep. The reason why is because it's more stringent. And those who have direct oversight of compounders, they just have to do it every year. Personnel that are involved in immediate use compounding must be trained and demonstrate competency in aseptic processes as they relate to assigned tasks and the facilities SOPs. Personnel who prepared immediate use CSPs are not required to perform media field tests, but the facilities SOP should determine how the competency should be done. Okay, so here's some factoids of the sterile compounding. So the person must remove wedding rings, eyelash extensions, all that kind of stuff. Um, and then the sterile gloves must be donned in a classified room. Hand dryers should not be used. Disposable soap containers should be replaced. Apply 70% isopropyl alcohol gloves immediately before compounding and regularly throughout the process. This just making sure that everything is sterile. Here it talks about some things such as the gowns and things of that sort, and the use of all lint outer gloves that must be sterile in category 3. Um, with sterile compounding, docking is not considered compounding. However, so docking is basically like you're putting a, I don't know. So for example, there are some products such as those vancomycin ones where you just have to like attach it into a normal saline bag. That's not really considered to be compounding because you're just putting that stuff in there. But if you're preparing a batch for future use, that becomes a compounding and needs to be done in an ISO 5 environment. CSPs can be compounded using only sterile ingredients or using some non-sterile ingredients, but they need to be sterilized. There's like things that are done to make sure everything is sterile. So they will autoclave it or things like that to ensure its sterility. Administration of a compounded sterile product cannot be used past beyond the beyond use time. So usually, in order to prevent that, um, if you work in a hospital, they'll probably pull it 4 hours in advance or even an hour in advance to make sure that you're not giving it to the patient. But if the administration or infusion has already begun and later it reaches the beyond use date and time, then the admin of this product can continue. That's the thing about that. CSPs must contain an amount of active ingredient that slightly exceeds the monograph limits. If a monograph exists or within 10% of intended active ingredient amount if no monograph exists. And at the bottom just explains like some of the sterile compounded categories. Okay. So here, um, it talks about at category 1, for example, your beyond use date is less than 12 hours at room temp, less than or equal to 24 hours when refrigerated. If it's in a clean room suite, the beyond use date is greater than 12 hours at room temp, greater than 24 hours if refrigerated. This is a category 3. And category 3 is just basically clean room suite plus additional requirements. You can have it as long as 180 days. These are some of the important things to know. Visual observation of hand hygiene and garbing with direct observation of compounders is greater, it's every 12 months. If it's category 1, 2, and 3, it's 6 months for category 1 and 2. Category 3 is every 3 months. Glove fingertip and thumb sampling, it's every 12 months. As y'all can see here, if it's with direct oversight of compounders, it's every 12 months. In this section, and for your category 1 and 2, as y'all can see, it's every 6 months, except for surface sampling that is done monthly, and every 3 months for category 3. And it's done monthly, the visible air sampling, and weekly for surface sampling. So remember, your primary engineering control, which is your hood, provides ISO 5 class air and LAFW or laminar airflow work hood, which is on your sterile ones, your khakis, or your CAIs, or your biological safety cabinets, which are your hoods. And then that's just some other things to know as well. Okay, and then lastly, we have hazardous compounding. Um, we're going to talk about what makes up a hazardous drug. So, hazardous drug needs to meet one or more of the following six characteristics, including carcinogenicity, teratogenicity, reproductive toxicity, organ toxicity, genotoxicity, and structure and toxicity profiles of new drugs that mimic existing drugs determine hazardous. And these are like some of the categories that it's on. So, group one are what is deemed to be anti-neoplastic drugs. Group two are non-anti-neoplastic drugs that meet one or more of the NICE criteria for hazardous drugs. And three are your non-anti-neoplastic drugs that primarily have adverse effects for reproduction. Okay, let's talk about assessment of risk. Assessment of risk may be performed for dosages forms to determine alternative containment strategies and or work practices. Usually, um, this are done in drugs or hazardous drugs that have minimal manipulation. So instead of them having to document everything, they just have to review it at least every 12 months. And then the review documented needs to include what type of hazardous drug it is. So we already talked about those three groups. What type of group is it? Is it the anti-neoplastic? Is it the non-anti-neoplastic or the non-anti-neoplastic with reproductive risk only? Dosage form, risk of exposure, packaging, manipulation, and designated persons. These are qualified and trained to be responsible for developing and implementing procedures. They oversee compliance with this chapter, the 800 specifically for hazardous, ensures the competency of personnel, and they thoroughly understand the rationale for risk prevention policies, risk to themselves and others, risk of non-compliance, and the responsibility to report potentially hazardous situations to the management team and responsible for the oversight of monitoring the facility and maintaining reports of testing, sampling performed in facilities, and acting on the results. And these are just some of the factoids when it comes to hazardous compounding. Um, that's pretty much really it.